Hi, folks. It's Professor Gaida here to talk to you today about rhythm and sound in poetry. There are key elements of rhythm and sound in poetry, and we can use these elements to manipulate rhythm and sound and to create certain effects that we want to create and certain emphases that we want to create. So those certain elements are consonants, vowels, which are types of letters in the alphabet, right? Consonants being most letters and vowels being A, E, I, O, and U. Alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds. Assonance, the repetition of vowel sounds. And stressed and unstressed syllables. So if you think about how words sound, the word rhythm, for example, re is a stressed syllable and them is an unstressed syllable. Poetry, po is a stressed syllable, is an unstressed syllable, right? Elements, L is a stressed syllable, is an unstressed syllable, mens is a stressed syllable, right? So stressed and unstressed syllables and patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. Now, meter is another tool related to stressed and unstressed syllables, which is the regular pattern or irregular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. And then rhyme, I think you know what rhyme is, but rhyme is essentially the repetition of similar sounds at the ends of words. It can also be the last two syllables of a word, but that's another story. It's called doubled rhyme. Okay, let's look at some of these elements one by one. Okay, the repetition of consonant sounds, which is alliteration. You can see it here in a poem like Pied Beauty by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins is a 19th century English poet who was also a clergyman who wrote a lot about nature and about divinity. And so I'll read this poem. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of color, couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows him how? With swift, slow, sweet, sour, dazzled, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. You could see alliteration at work in a number of places in this poem. In the first line, for example, the G in glory, the G in God. A little bit later, in the second line, the C in couple, the C in color, the C in cow. So, and then in the fourth line, the fresh fire coal falls, benches. So alliteration has the effect of both emphasizing, calling attention to certain syllables or words. So glory, which already has an accented syllable, gets double attention from the fact that it is coupled, the G in glory is coupled with the G in God in this line. So it gets double attention from the fact that the G in glory is coupled with the G in God. Okay, so glory be to God. We are tying together, we are emphasizing those syllables. We are also tying them together so that the idea of glory is tied to the idea of God. And then later, in the second line, we get the same technique alliteration again, but this time, in addition to in the second line, we get the use of alliteration again, but this time, in addition to emphasizing the syllables, placing an emphasis on those three words and syllables, we get again this tying together of, in this case, not so much an idea as an image, the couple colored cow, right? And so that's, I would say, the general rule of two ways that alliteration can tie things together. It can tie ideas together in a line. It can also tie images together in a line. So it becomes a very useful. It also is a way to carry the line, the momentum of the line and the music of the line forward. We keep repeating. It's almost like rhyme, but it's sort of a weaker version of it, right? It's just a single letter. Okay. So we'll get rid of some of these notations and we'll talk about the sister concept to alliteration, which is assonance. right, which is the repetition of vowel sounds. And we see it here in a poem called Mid-August at Sourdough Mountain Lookout by Gary Snyder. Down valley of smoke haze, 3 days heat after 5 days rain, pitch glows on the fir cones, across rocks and meadows, swarms of new flies. I cannot remember things I once read, a few friends, but they are in cities, drinking cold snow water from a tin cup, looking down for miles through high, still air. So in this poem, we see some instances of assonance. The A in haze, the A in days, the A in days again, and the A in rain, tying all of these images, haze, day, rain, together, right? And then later, pitch glows on fir cones. So the glowing of the cone, another image, right? The cold snow, right? And then finally the miles through high air. And Snyder in this case uses the images to focus on, uses assonance to focus on images in nature, which is not surprising because Snyder is a kind of a Buddhist sensibility poet, a California poet of the 20th and 21st century. He's still alive, he's about 90. But he wants you to focus on these images in nature. And so he does it by using assonance. And one of the musical difference between assonance and alliteration, I'll go back to that for a minute. One of the differences between assonance and alliteration is that in alliteration, the consonant sounds tend to be harder. Not always, but they tend to be harder than the vowel sounds. The vowel sounds tend to flow more. And so this idea that a vowel sound would complement a natural image, a vowel sound in assonance would complement a natural image, makes a lot of sense. All right, so Snyder exploits that in this poem. Okay, once again, we'll get rid of some of these annotations, and we'll move on to talking from talking about some of the more sonic techniques to some of the more rhythmic techniques. So we'll talk about feet of stresses, feet of stressed and unstressed syllables. A foot is a unit of stressed and unstressed syllables. So a number of them taken together. And I'll use this poem by E.E. Cummings, who was an early 20th century American poet, to emphasize the use of feet, because there are a number of different kinds of feet, what we call metrical feet, in this poem, that is combinations of stressed and unstressed syllables, right? Anyone lived in a pretty how town with up so floating many bells down, spring, summer, autumn, winter. He sang his didn't, he danced his did. Women and men, both little and small, cared for anyone not at all. They sowed their isn't, they reaped their same, sun, moon, stars, rain. Children guessed, but only a few, and down they forgot, as up they grew. Autumn, winter, spring, summer, that no one loved him more by more. And the poem goes on. You'll see that there's a kind of dominant rhythm in this poem. There's a dominant foot, kind of foot. And that foot, that dominant foot, is apparent here in the second line. With up, so flow, ding, men. Well, up, so floating, many bells down, right? And that dominant rhythm is an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. So an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And we call that rhythm an iamb. It's one of these types of feet, an iambic foot, unstressed, stressed. So with up, so floating, many bells down, and there's a little variation, dun, 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 but with up, so float, right? Da dum, da dum. And then in the line that follows, we get a slightly different rhythm. Spring, right? Summer, autumn, winter. And if we take the seasons as metrical feet, spring is like an extra syllable at the beginning of the line, which you can have. You can have extra syllables that don't match the rhythm of the rest of the line, but most of the line is a different rhythm. It's stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. So it's the opposite, right? Unstressed. Stress is an iamb, and stressed, unstressed is something called a trochee. Okay, so you're getting different rhythms at different times. We're moving from a focus on this person, right? Anyone lived in a pretty, and in fact, the first line is a different rhythm, the focus on the person. Anyone lived in a pretty how town. Anyone lived in a pretty how town. Da, da, da. So anyone lived in a pretty how town. If we take it from here, in a pretty how town. So if we knock off that first syllable, we take it from here, E1 lived in a pretty how town. That pattern is unstressed, unstressed, stressed. And this is called an anapest. Now, that's 3 different kinds of feet within one poem. That's not unusual because poets often will not use what's called regular meter, where every foot has to be exactly the same. Sometimes they'll just manipulate different types of feet at different points in the poem and maybe have one dominant kind of foot in the poem. And in this poem, I would argue that the dominant one is the iamb. And down they forgot, as up they grew. That the dum rhythm keeps returning, even though we get a kind of looser rhythm for the opening, which focuses on one person, and we get the establishment of the regular rhythm, and then we get the passing of seasons gets a slightly different rhythm, but we keep coming back to that da-dum, 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 da-dum. And the other rhythms kind of keep that from becoming monotonous, right? And also to signal a change in focus and a slight change in subject. So even rhythm can be used to do that, to signal that we're moving on to a slightly different idea or a slightly different image here, or a slightly different scale of things, right? Okay, so that is what we call a metrical foot. And as I just said, there are different kinds, as you can see in this poem. And those different kinds have different names, and I'll show you those in a second. Now, when we talk about the pattern, a regular pattern of feet in a poem, well, first, let me show you this. These are, in fact, what we just talked about, the types of meter in poetry, the types of patterns of syllables you will see in a foot, right? So iambic, we talked about da-dum, trochaic, dum-dum, spondaic, dum-dum, 2 stressed syllables in a foot. And then those are metrical feet that have 2 syllables. There are also metrical feet that have 3 syllables. And the 2 dominant kinds there are called the anapest, which I just showed you, unstressed, unstressed, stressed, so da-da-dum. And then the dactyl, which is the opposite, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, dum-da-dum. So anapest, da-da-dum, dactyl, dum-da-dum. And you can combine all 5 of these kinds in different ways to create different patterns of rhythm through the whole poem, or you can repeat one kind of foot over and over again to create a very regular rhythm in the poem. Okay. So if we go back to meter, meter is this very regular pattern of meter is this very regular pattern of a certain kind of metrical foot, right? And we see it in this poem called My Papa's Waltz, which uses mostly this pattern. Again, the I am, the dum, right? But as you'll see, there's a little variation because of the subject of this poem. My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke, another American poet from Michigan. He lived in the middle of the 20th century. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. And you'll say, okay, professor, I see it. I see that there is this regular pattern of stressed and unstressed, right? Stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. And you'll say also, you might ask also, professor, how do I know what's stressed and what's not stressed? By speaking the line out loud. And by speaking it the way you would normally say it, or most people would normally say it, right? The whiskey on your breath, the whiskey on, and then think about the stress. The whiskey on your breath, the whiskey on your breath. Now, if I said the whiskey on your breath, it would sound totally different and unusual, right? And you would never say whiskey. You would always say whiskey. And there are some words that are like that. They're always going to have, most words are always going to have a kind of fixed pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. There will be variations for different regions, different kinds of pronunciation, but usually a word like whiskey, the stress is always going to be on that first syllable. And that's how you know what the pattern of stressed and unstressed is, by saying the line out loud. Could make a small boy dizzy, could make a small boy dizzy, right? Could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. And you'll say, professor, okay, as before, I hear it. I hear the dum, the dum, the dum, the dum. I hear it. But what about this little syllable at the end? You say, I hear it, but what about this little syllable at the end of this line? And this little syllable at the end of this line is just sort of hanging there. It's unstressed. It doesn't fit the pattern. Well, yeah, he had a reason for that. Roethke is writing a poem about a boy dancing with his father who's come home drunk. So the dance is a little off rhythm. So to give you that sense, he gives you that extra syllable. Right? And a good example of how rhythm can reflect subject or complement the subject of the poem. And then the rest of the poem, he gets back to this kind of regular rhythm. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. Okay. So a good illustration of the use of predominantly iambic rhythm. Okay, we'll erase this. And get on to our final concept, which is rhyme. Rhyme is a technique you will probably use at some point, but I urge you not to overuse or to make the whole point of writing poetry. The whole point of writing poetry is not so you can write rhymes. Rhymes are nice, they're a good tool, but there are many other tools in your toolbox. Now, that said, I'm going to give you a poem that is memorable for its use of rhyme. But unlike a lot of poems that use rhyme, it doesn't rhyme on the last word of the line. And there is a reason for that in this poem. This poem is called We Real Cool. It's by Gwendolyn Brooks, a mostly mid-20th century American poet, but she lived until 2001 from Chicago. And she's writing about the pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. Okay, now, Okay, now you see that that poem obviously uses rhyme. You can hear it. Now, where is the rhyme? Well, it's there, 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 and there. Not exactly at the end of most lines, because the end is taken up with this word we. Okay, but the rhyme is still there. Now, rhyme does not have to come at the end of a line. You could rhyme a word at the end of one line in the middle of the next. You could rhyme a word at the beginning of one line in the middle of the next, or the middle of the one line in the middle of the next. When you rhyme a word in the middle of the line or anywhere that's not the end, it's using internal, it's called internal rhyme. You rhyme a word often with a word in the same line. She doesn't do that here, but she does. You rhyme a word, you can rhyme a word with another word in the same line. That's called internal rhyme. Here she does something a little clever and a little different. She rhymes the word with another word in sort of the middle of the line. It's almost the end, except for the word we. It's almost the end of the line, except for the word we. And you might wonder, well, why is she doing that? Okay, well, there's a good reason. In this poem is about these pool players who are we, and they are we throughout the whole poem, right? Until the end, when they die soon and they're not there anymore. But she wants you to pay attention to them being there and then not being there. At the same time, she wants you to pay attention to the fact that they are kind of cool and hip, and they use rhyme because that's how cool hip people talk, right? Cool, school, late, straight, sin, gin, June, June, soon. So rhyme can be really useful, but you have to use it mindfully. You have to use it for a purpose at different points. You have to use rhyme mindfully. You have to use it for a purpose in the poem or for different purposes in the poem. Right? It is another tool, just like all the other tools we just discussed.